My name is David. I'm the men's leader here, and I will be continuing our sermon series. The sermon series, Stories. We started with a mysterious figure, Melchizedek. From Melchizedek, we went to perhaps a more well-known person in the story, Stephen. Stephen, a New Testament person who is a deacon, raised up to an apostle, and became the first martyr. And from Stephen, we went from somebody who's remembered for just how incredible his faith and courage was to someone that we don't think of that way, in Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed Jesus. So today, we're going to lighten that up a little bit. We're going to go back to the Old Testament, and we're going to talk about Ruth. Now, Ruth begins in the time of the Judges. The Judges were the time after Moses had led the people to the Promised Land and before the kingdom. So the time in between, before Samuel, the last judge. At that time, Naomi and her husband, they were in Israel, but there was a famine in the land. And the famine was severe, and they chose to go to Moab to find food. So it's important to note that during this time that they're leaving, that the land is important. Now, when I was young, I learned about the land from my dad. I was younger than my daughter, Sophia. She's 12, and my dad used to talk to me about biblical times, and he talked about a world lit only by fire. And I picture a summer evening, cool with that warm breeze that you have in the summer, and Abraham is there, and God comes to Abraham, and God sweeps his hand, and you can see the stars as he's telling to Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to make a great nation of you. And those that you bless, I will bless. And those that you curse, I will curse. I learned all this from my dad. He would come and talk to us, and he had these rotating days off because he worked for United Airlines. And he worked swing shifts. We didn't see him consistently. And he'd say, who wants to go have lunch with me? And I always wanted to go because I was always hungry. And also, at a young age, I had a fear of missing out. And so we would go to Taco Bell. That was the place that we would learn. And they had the $59, $79, $99 menu. And I was allowed to get one item from the 99-cent menu, or two items from the 79-cent menu, or three items from the 59-cent menu. And I was all about volume. So I would get three from the 59-cent menu. And so it was at this time that I really started to learn about Abraham and the covenant that God made with Abraham. And the covenant was the land, the seed, and the blessing. The land at that time was Canaan, the land of Canaan, which would ultimately become Israel. The descendants would be the Israelites that would come from the offspring of Abraham. Now, the offspring of Abraham is a big deal. I don't know how many people in here are over 60, but if God came to you and said, I'm going to make a great nation of you, this could be a little bit surprising. It would also be good news to know that in your old age that you were going to have children, as children were a sign of wealth at that time in our history. And of those descendants was also to come the Messiah. If we rewind all the way back to Genesis, there is that promise made to Eve that a seed will come from her. And that seed works all the way through to Abraham, to the descendants from there. And then that blessing that I mentioned, the blessing that Abraham, those who you bless, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. And so Abraham and his brother Lot, they start to grow in abundance. They start to grow in the produce from the land. They grow in livestock. They grow in servants to be over the livestock. And as brothers do, they start to outgrow their space. So picture two teenage brothers in their bedroom, and it's time to mark what's mine and what's yours. You can see them with a roll of duct tape, running it down the middle, saying, this is mine, don't touch over here. And so Abraham and Lot, they come together to divide the land. And it says in Genesis 13:10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the Jordan Valley contains the land of Moab. the land that Naomi and the family are going to go to from Israel. That's where Lot is sojourning. Now that land was flowing with water, similar to the Garden of Eden. And then Sodom and Gomorrah comes, and maybe not so much. But at that time, Lot was pretty greedy. He was looking for the better land between the two of them. And Abraham was dealing kindly. He knew that God would take care of him. He was faithful of that. And so he allowed Lot to have the better land. And here we see that Abraham is blessing Lot. And God will continue to bless Lot. So, if we fast forward about half a millennia, the Israelites are now in Egypt. And they quite literally are being cursed by the Egyptians. And upon their exit from Egypt, we hear Moses as they're about to enter the promised land. Moses retells the story of the Israelites, their time in captivity in Egypt, their time wandering in the desert, and what they're going to do as they enter into the promised land. And he had something to say about Moab. And so in Deuteronomy 2:9, it says, "And the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession." Now Ar is a city within Moab. And so what God is plainly telling to the Israelites at this time is that as you are fleeing Egypt, as you are moving through the wilderness toward the promised land, contending with other nations, having to fight. This is part of what occurs in Exodus and in Numbers. You can't take up arms against Moab, because I won't give them to you. They belong to Lot. I've blessed Lot. I can't allow that to happen to you. And so this is another sign of the blessing that God is showing on Abraham and on the Israelites. But there is a curse. And we get to the curse when we get to Deuteronomy 23:3-4. And here we have, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from the Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you." There's that word, curse. So the Moabites didn't just curse them. They went and got a prophet so that he would cast a curse on Israel. And so because of this, the blessing which was placed on Moab because of Lot, because the Moabites are Lot's descendants, that blessing also carries with it now a curse because of the curse that they put on the Israelites. And this is a big deal. As we shift our focus back to Ruth, now we understand a bit more of what Naomi and her husband are doing. They're not just leaving the promised land, which unto itself, it's a questionable thing to do. They're leaving the promised land to go to a land of people who are cursed, a land of people where if their sons marry, they have no inheritance with the Israelites' people. Those who marry and their offspring, they're no longer Israelites. And so that's the setting for which we go to Ruth. Now, Ruth and her husband, they had 2 sons. And those 2 sons, when they got to Moab, they married 2 women, one of which are Ruth. And shortly after they're in Moab, Naomi's husband dies, and the 2 husbands of the daughter-in-laws die. So Naomi is left with her 2 daughter-in-laws. Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws, "Go back to the homes of your families. They can take care of you. Perhaps they can find husbands for you." Because being a widow in the ancient world, it's a dangerous thing. It was a tough life for a widowed woman. There wasn't much for them to earn, for them to eat. And so she urges them to go. But the 2 women say, "No, I'll stay with you, Naomi." And Naomi tells them, "If I had sons in my womb right now and were married, could you wait until they were grown to marry? No, please, go back." And one of the daughter-in-laws goes back to be married with them. But Ruth, she stays. And in staying, we get the famous verse from Ruth, perhaps the most famous verse. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. It's a wonderful verse. It's a verse that we often hear at weddings, where someone is casting their allegiance to another person. Here, Ruth is not just choosing to stay with her mother-in-law. She's choosing to serve the living God of Israel. This is a big deal in the ancient world, for someone to leave their own gods and choose another. But Ruth is choosing Naomi, Israel, and the God of Israel. And I imagine during this time, Ruth was still dealing with depression. Depression from losing her husband. Depression from the loss which is all around her. When I was in middle school, my parents divorced. It was a very sudden thing. One day my father was there, and in a traumatic event, I didn't know the next time that I was going to see him. During that time, I thought I had a decision to make, whether or not I would live with my mother or with my father. And so I asked my father if I could go and live with him. And he said no. He said that I needed to live with my mom. And my relationship wasn't great with my mom. And so at that time, I felt particularly unwanted. Felt unwanted by my dad, who I wanted to live with, and unwanted by my mother, who I was living with, but I felt like she preferred my sisters. I had 3 sisters. And so I became depressed from these feelings of unwanted. I was in therapy, sometimes daily. I had insomnia, and I became suicidal. I felt quite powerless. I started to distance myself from most of my friends. But I started to have some new friends. Some people wanted to stand by me. One of my friends, Eric, he went to church. And I remember going to church with him on Easter Sunday. It was a great sermon. I don't remember any of it. And I remember leaving church that day, and one of the people from the youth group invited me to youth group. And I felt wanted for the first time in a very long time. I felt powerless in that situation where I couldn't choose where I would live. But I felt some sense of agency in being able to choose that I could go to church, that I could have new friends, that I could do this. And that lifeline that I felt from being invited to church was a big part of that. I think Ruth likely felt powerless as well in her situation. Naomi and Ruth found that back in Israel, that the famine had subsided and that things were better in Israel. So the two of them decided to go back to Israel. And so in going back to Israel, Ruth begins to work. So she takes some agency in her life, even though the powerlessness that she feels, and she goes to work the field. Now, those of you who are here for the Justice series, you'll know kind of what she's doing here. You see, the Israelites, when they would glean the field, they could only pass so many times. And when they gleaned, they had to leave the corners of the fields. And this was specifically done so that the widows who weren't cared for and the poor could go and they could get food from the corners and from what's left over from the gleaning. And so Ruth is doing this. This is a provision that God had created for the widowed in Israel. And as she's doing so, the person who's over the field, Boaz, he takes notice. He notices that there's this new young woman in the field. And he asks one of his men, he says, "Who's this woman, that young woman working the field?" And they tell him, "It's Ruth, the Moabite, who has come back with Naomi." And he instructs the young men to tell her that she's to stay close to his other young women, and that where they draw water, that she can draw water. And Ruth is surprised by the favor that she has found from Boaz. Favor that I think that she's surprised because she's a foreigner from Moab. I'm not sure how many of you have experience being a foreigner. When I was in the Marines, I lived in Okinawa, Japan for 2 years. Living in a foreign country, everything is different. They speak a different language. Sometimes people look different. The weather's different. The buildings are different. I smelled different in Okinawa. I can't explain why that is, but if you've been to a foreign country, you may understand what I'm talking about. Sometimes you want a little bit of a piece of home when you're in a foreign country. And so we went to McDonald's, and you can't imagine the disappointment. The fries, they are not like the fries in Texas. They are not supersized. And the sip of Coke that I had, it did not wash it down. And the Big Mac, it is anything but big. We would go to other places in town in Okinawa, and sometimes people would raise their arms like this to us. And it meant that American servicemen weren't welcome there. I grew to resent the Okinawan people. I thought that they hated me. I thought that they hated American servicemen. And I grew in my resentment toward them. But I had friends in the Marines who had Okinawan girlfriends. And I would ask them, like, number one, how did you meet an Okinawan? How did you get an Okinawan to like you? And how did you get one to date you? And my friend Nelson, he told me, there are many Okinawan women who are interested in getting to know servicemen, who are happy that we're here, and would like nothing better but to get to know and spend time with us. Now, I imagine what they were looking for were honorable and respectful men. I was anything but. Going back to Ruth, she was honorable and respectful. She was being known for the honor and respect that she was showing. If we go to Ruth chapter 2, verse 11, here we find what people are saying about Ruth. All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Remember that word, wings. So Ruth is being set aside. She's being recognized that she's this Moabite that came to Israel with Naomi. Naomi, when she came back, she's so depressed, she's so downtrodden. She said, don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. And Ruth is taking care of her, and people are taking notice. And in this taking notice, Boaz, he sees Ruth, and he says to her, come and have lunch with me. And so you picture Boaz kind of patting the seat, asking Ruth to come by, and he gives her bread and wine. My daughter and I, we watched the Disney movie Wish not too long ago. It's full of Easter eggs. It's kind of the big thing about it. Boaz giving Ruth bread and wine. It's a bit of an Easter egg right there. We're going back to Melchizedek, maybe forward to Jesus. It'll come back for us. So they're sitting together, they're eating lunch, they're talking to each other. And this reminds me of some of the times that Christy and I and our family, we spend together. You see, we like to watch Hallmark movies. We don't just watch Hallmark movies at Christmas. We watch Hallmark movies year-round. And when the executive lady from New York flies into the small town and the gruff-looking guy in flannel doesn't help her with her bags, Christy will turn to me and say, they're going to fall in love. The formula of the Hallmark story, it never gets old to us. They're all the same, but it's okay. You've got, the prince and the pauper, the fish out of water, and one of the classic stories, Pygmalion. Now, those of you who aren't familiar with what a Pygmalion is, I assure you, you have seen one. You may have seen it in a version of the movie My Fair Lady, or you might have seen it in the most famous version of Pygmalion, Pretty Woman, where a rich man takes a lowly woman and raises her up to aristocracy, right? And I know what you're saying, guys. I don't watch those kinds of movies. Well, guess what? You've seen a Pygmalion too. It's called Rocky. Apollo Creed takes a fighter down on his luck in the street, Rocky, and raises him up to title contention. It's a Pygmalion. It's a love story. It's just a love story with gloves on. Now, we also like love stories as they come in Disney movies in our house. And one story in particular, Cinderella, is similar to Ruth. Now, we all know that Disney stories, they begin the same way. Subtract a parent. And in the story of Cinderella, the father dies, and Cinderella is left with her evil stepmother. And she's in poverty. She's working hard. much like Ruth. And she's waiting for that ball where her prince will come, and she'll be taken out of poverty and into that life to come. So, as we shift back to Ruth, Ruth is eating, drinking with Boaz. She's got some extra food, and she goes home to Naomi. And she shares the food with Naomi. And Naomi's liking it. Like, this is all right. She's like, where did you get this food? How did this go? She said, I was working the field. And whose field were you working? I was working the field of Boaz. And and Naomi perks up. Boaz. Boaz is a relative of ours. He's a kinsman redeemer. And so we have to go back to Deuteronomy to think about what a kinsman redeemer is, if you're not familiar with that. So we go to Deuteronomy 25:5. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. So here we have a law for the Israelites where if a brother dies, his closest relative is to marry his wife and go into her. Now, this is a law for the Israelites, but there's also a custom in the ancient world. If we go back to Genesis, Onan is supposed to do this for a relative, and he fails to do so, and God has some judgment for him. And I think what we see in the Bible is that this custom, which is customary in the ancient world, is made into a law for Israel, and they conduct it a certain way to be set apart from the rest of the world. So the kinsman redeemer is a way for the widow to be taken care of again. Another provision that God has for widows to take care of them in the ancient world. So Naomi has some advice for Ruth. Naomi's lived a little. She knows how to get a man. And she tells Ruth, here's what I want you to do. I want you to wait for Boaz to eat and to drink fully. And when he goes to lay down at night, I want you to go lay at his feet, because he'll go lay in the field, and I want you to lay at his feet in the field. And so Ruth listens to Naomi. And it says that Boaz, he went and he ate and he drank until he was merry. I don't think he was drinking grape juice. And he went and he laid in the field, and Ruth went and laid at his feet. And so as Boaz is laying there, he gets startled, and he notices that there's this woman at his feet. And so in Ruth 3:9, he said, "Who are you?" And she answers, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." There's that word again, wings. In this case, this is likely referring to the use of the word wings as spread the fringe of your garment over me. Or in this case, can I share your blanket? But also notice that before he was saying, you've come to take refuge under the wings of Israel. And here Ruth is rightly recognizing that she can take refuge under the wings of her Redeemer, Boaz. Now, I think that Boaz was an honorable man, because he didn't just say, yeah, hop into bed, let's do this. He recognized with Ruth that, number one, this was an honorable thing that she was doing. She recognized that she had a kinsman redeemer. He notices, I'm an older man. You could have gone after a younger man, and you came to me. In addition, he tells her, there is a closer relative to you, which to me makes it clear that he was thinking about Ruth. You don't just walk around knowing your family tree and how it relates to the Moabite that came into town if you're not thinking about, I wouldn't mind if I was able to be her kinsman redeemer. And so he tells her that in Ruth chapter 3, verse 12 through 13, and now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. And so here, he promises to marry her if she is not redeemed the next day. And so we can clearly see that there is more to this romance than there appears. So Boaz goes to the gate of the city at this point. The gate of the city is where the business takes place in the ancient world. And so Boaz waits for some of the elders to come to the gate, about 10 elders, and he waits for the kinsman redeemer to come. And in the presence of the elder and the kinsman redeemer, he says to the redeemer in Ruth chapter 4, verse 3, "Then he said to the redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." First complication. So those of you who watch Hallmark stories, you know that there's that point where one of the characters overhears someone else on the phone with their ex-girlfriend or something like that, and they get worried and they run off. Feels like we have a bit of that right here, right? Where we're not sure if Ruth and Boaz are going to end up together. But Boaz isn't done. And he tells the kinsman redeemer, just know that when you buy this land, you don't just inherit this land, but with it comes Ruth the Moabite. And so in Ruth chapter 4, verse 6, the kinsman redeemer responds. Then the redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Lest I impair my own inheritance. What does that mean? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would getting a piece of land and having Ruth the Moabite impair his inheritance? And so we go back to that curse. We go back to the curse that was placed on Moab, that none of them are to enter the assembly, to the 10th generation or forever. And so what the kinsman redeemer is saying is that I intend to have my children continue in their lineage in Israel. And if I marry a Moabite, that is gone. Boaz is fine with this. This is not a problem for him. In this short amount of time, he loves Ruth, and he would like to marry her. Curse or no curse. And so, in the presence of the elders, Boaz tells them, having you passed on your right to redeem this land, I choose to redeem it. And as was the custom in that time, he removed his sandal and he presented it to the redeemer. And that was the sign that he would redeem Ruth. And he walked away from there. And he and Ruth were married, and they had a child. And the boy was placed on the knees of Naomi. And the woman who would be called bitter was filled with joy. And they named the boy Obed. Now, some of you may recognize that name, Obed. But you may be more familiar with the name of his son, Jesse. And if you don't remember the name Jesse, I think you'll remember the name of his son, David. David, who should have lost his inheritance through the curse that came through Ruth. David, who would become the second king of Israel. Because our God is a redeeming God. Charles Spurgeon, in his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, talks about how we live under the arbitrary will of an angry God, and that at any time we can fall. But here we recognize that we live under the arbitrary will of a loving God with infinite redemption, that no matter the curse, he can graft that into the work that he is doing, into the messianic line, that blessing that comes from Eve through Abraham, through Ruth, through David, ultimately to Jesus. His redemption can overcome that. So, that is the story of Ruth, a story of loss, of hopelessness, of grief, of love, and redemption. Now, I think about Naomi in this story. Ruth was the foreigner who came from Moab and went to Israel. But Naomi was also the person who went from Israel to Moab and back. And like I mentioned before, I went to Okinawa and I served there in the Marines. And then I came home. And I felt just as foreign when I came home. The home that I came back to, it was fields when I left. It was just open fields. And when I came back, it was full of homes and shopping centers. The friends that I thought that I had, they were gone. They didn't wait for 4 years for me to come back and take up our friendship again. In fact, some of them, they heard a rumor that I was dead. And so I felt isolated. I felt alone. And I didn't feel that I had anyone that I could talk to about this. And I did have someone that I could talk to about it in the form of my mother. My mother is a resident alien from Denmark by way of Canada. She's never become a naturalized citizen of the United States. She knows full well what it's like to go from one country to another and be unlike everyone else, to start over and to be different. But like I mentioned before, the relationship that I had with my mother was strained. Those feelings of unwanted, even though some of that was helped by being in youth group when I was in high school, it waned when I got out of the Marines. I felt very alone, very unwanted. Some of the coping mechanisms that I learned in the Marines, I carried with me when I left from the Marine Corps. Shortly after separating from the Marines, I met my wife, Christy. Our courtship wasn't like Ruth and Boaz. Ruth and Boaz, at the most, spent a season together from meeting to marriage, and maybe a few days. Christy and I's courtship was 4 years. During that time, I did a lot of unhealthy things. It is the grace and mercy of Christy that allows me to be standing before you today, talking about Ruth. Sometimes I forget the most memorable verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Now, what part of that verse do I forget? Do I forget that God loved the world? No. No, I know that God loves the world. Did I forget that Jesus paid it all? No. No, intellectually, I understand. Jesus paid it all. No, I forget that God loved me. I can look out and I can say, yeah, God loves Christy. Christy's a lovable person. I can see why he would love her. I see Eli back there. Eli's a good guy. I can see why God would love him. And for much of my life, I lived a life where I felt unlovable, and that included by God. But then we get to that third part of the verse, that whosoever believes. That's the part for me. That's my job, to believe that God loves me, to believe that Jesus came and paid it all for me so that I might have everlasting life. When I think about the redemption that Jesus has for us, I think about Ephesians 1. Ephesians 1, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace. And I have many trespasses. I need forgiveness of those trespasses, and I need redemption through his blood and through his grace. And like we've seen in the story of Ruth, that grace is incredibly strong. And I also have to think about 1 Corinthians 6:19, where it says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. You were bought with a price. There's something interesting about that. I had a hard time this week thinking about an illustration about redemption, which is ironic because I'm a coach for a company called Redemptive Living. You'd think we'd know something about redemption. But in trying to think of an illustration about redemption, I was fortunate that I was at a workshop this past weekend and someone did it for me. You see, he told me something about the parable of the treasure in the field. Now, for those of you who don't know, the parable of the treasure of the field is that there was a man who found a treasure in a field. And upon finding it, he went and sold everything that he had to buy the field and to claim that treasure. Now, in my arrogance, I thought I had that down pat. The treasure in the field is salvation. And that I will go sell everything that I have, buy the field, and I will have salvation. Easy peasy, right? It's got to be what that means. But no. You see, we look back to the story of Ruth. Boaz, he bought a field. And in that field, he also had his treasure, which was Ruth, and he redeemed her. And you see, with Jesus, I'm that treasure. And Jesus, by dying on the cross, he paid for that field so that he would claim me, his treasure. And I think he would do the same I think he has done the same for all of you. He sees every one of you as his treasure. And he bought the field so that he could have that treasure, which is you. Amen? Amen. Amen.